Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, Republicans passed the most expensive bill in the history of the Senate. Why? To cut taxes for billionaires and at the same time cutting Medicaid and SNAP for needy families. But now, Republicans are pretending they are concerned about the debt. So concerned that they need to shut down local radio stations. So concerned they're going to cut off Sesame Street. They're so concerned they want to whack away at our global credibility and slash humanitarian aid in the process. The idea that this is about balancing the debt is laughable. You could cut every dollar ever spent on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting since it was created, and it would not cover the cost of the bill that the Republicans just jammed through. You could cut every dollar we have spent on foreign aid since World War II, and that total would still fall short compared to the cost of Republican tax cuts. Or how about this? If Republicans cut the amount in this rescissions bill every single day for a year, it still would not equal their tax cuts to help rich donors. So I hope I made the point. Let's stop pretending this move is about the debt. And let's stop pretending there's no alternative to passing a partisan rescissions package that cuts bipartisan funding, because I have been clear over and over, there is an alternative, which is to do what we always do and discuss rescissions as part of our annual funding bills instead of doing Trump's bidding. Mr. President, let's talk about what's at stake here, starting with the damage that these cuts would do to our communities by cutting rural areas off from local news and emergency alerts, and ending high-quality kids programming. If Republicans pass this package they're offering, they're going to slash funding for over 1,500 local news stations nationwide. These are stations that provide an enormous community service, especially in rural areas and in our tribal communities. They cover stories that matter to families, but that often get overlooked by national news. These stations and this funding reaches 98% of all Americans. And let's not forget, they also deliver local emergency alerts. Some of these local radio stations are a genuine lifeline for communities when disaster strikes. Who among us thinks our communities should have less warning when there's an emergency? Because that is what voting for this package means. It also means cutting off funding for high-quality kids programming. There's a reason shows like Sesame Street are beloved by kids and parents. It's not just entertaining. It gets our kids thinking. It teaches them about math and spelling and caring and kindness. And if Republicans let shows like this get canceled, they're going to open up the floodgates to a wave of what I call brain rot TV that is engineered to keep our kids watching. To my colleagues who think they have short-term temporary fixes to reduce cuts to 1 or 2 public radio stations or television states in their states, that will not solve the problem. And what do you say to those 120 rural stations that will lose 25% or more of their funding? What do you say to the dozens of rural stations that will shut down because of this bill and cut off local news, educational programming, and life-saving services to the rural communities that we serve? And let's not forget, the other cuts in this bill would seriously undercut our credibility on the world stage. I thought American leadership was worth investing in. And when we voted for those funds, so did Republicans. Did Republicans forget why we thought that was important when we voted for them? Did Republicans forget that outbreaks spread if we do not help stop them? Did they forget that humanitarian assistance doesn't just prevent death, but it prevents chaos and conflict, keeps our American troops out of harm's way? Did they forget that these investments bring business to our American companies and they help feed the world? or that building alliances and playing a leading role at international organizations allows us to advance our interests and counter our adversaries? And set aside the global strategy for the moment. We should not be voting to let children starve or die from preventable diseases. We should be voting to go, shouldn't be voting to go back on our word to the world. Saving a couple pennies is not worth losing our credibility or causing millions of deaths across the globe. It's not even close. If Republicans really care about the debt, they can start by revisiting the $4 trillion in tax breaks they just showered on billionaires. Now, Mr. President, there's a lot more to say about how damaging these cuts would be for our country, but you don't have to take my word for it, because even several of my Republican colleagues have said it themselves. They don't like this package. They're already trying to dial it back the tiniest bit, but I do know they have concerns. Here's a tip. If you don't like it, don't vote for it. Think about who you take orders from, President Trump, Russ Vought, or your own constituents and your own communities. And let's be honest, for all of his bluster, President Trump will forget about this in a week. He doesn't care about rescissions. He probably doesn't even know what it means. And if you don't like this package, but you think you should do more targeted rescissions, you know what? We can discuss that in a bipartisan way, completely separate from this partisan package. I've been clear, and I will say it again right now. I stand ready to discuss rescissions as part of the bipartisan spending bills, just as we have always done. That is the right way to go about this. How many times, Mr. President, have Republicans called for regular order? Well, at no point in our country's history, no point have partisan rescissions been regular order. Anytime we've done this in the past, it has been bipartisan. Republicans should join us to make sure this does not become a bad new first, and to ensure that our time on the floor is spent considering important legislation, including our funding bills, rather than one rescissions request after another. We are working right now to advance FY26 bills right now at this very moment, and hopefully in a bipartisan way. We passed the first two out of committee last week. I want us to continue that work. But I really worry that passage of these bills is going to complicate the road ahead even more. Because if Republicans decide it's fine to undo the last bipartisan spending deal with Trump's partisan cuts, then getting these bills across the finish line is going to get really hard. And if they keep this kind of thing up, one of these days Republicans are going to find they broke the process. Let me spell out what that looks like, because I think there's a misconception here that wrongly convinces some members it's okay. This is the straw that won't break the camel's back. The reality is bipartisanship doesn't end with any one line being crossed. It erodes, it breaks down bit by bit until the day there's nothing left. Don't get me wrong, the negotiating table is always there. And in my experience, there are usually a few members willing to stick it out and work as hard as they can to get a result. But here's the thing. The Senate doesn't work off of a few members. It works off of consensus, building, and bipartisanship. And the more bridges you burn, the fewer paths you leave to get things done. You can't just keep pushing people away and breaking that basic trust that keeps this place working. Not to mention, if Republicans pass this package of cuts, Russ Vought has made it abundantly clear he will send more. If Republicans pass this package now, we're going to be back here in a month debating whether to rip away funding for, say, after-school programs, instead of spending our time doing the hard work, passing laws, instead of considering the bipartisan spending bills we are working on right now. Is this floor just going to be drowned in package after package of partisan cuts, fighting over how much of the last deal that we are now going to unravel, fighting over whose projects get canceled, whose communities get robbed? Mr. President, I hope not. I am going to end now with something I talked about during our committee hearing that we held on this package. When I first came to this Congress, one of the hot button issues was the line item veto. President Clinton of my party was asking to have it. Chairman Byrd of my party was organizing against it with Republicans. I was asked, should a Democratic Senate help a Democratic president rip up the bills that we all work together to pass? I said no. I said no, that is not how this should work. I came here to help my state and my constituents, not to weaken or surrender those responsibilities to any president. That is as true for me today as it was then. And if my colleagues agree, which I believe many of them do, then the course we have to take here is clear. We need to reject this package outright. That doesn't mean we can't have a bipartisan conversation about the rescissions as we now write our funding bills. That is the way that we need to do that. That is the way it's always been done. But we have to reject this new precedent of partisan standalone rescissions if this place is going to work, if we're going to work together to serve the folks we represent back home. We have to make choices that help us move closer together and bring more people to the table, not choices that push us apart and chip away bit by bit at the trust that makes this place work. Otherwise, one day, we will find we have none of that trust left. So I urge my colleagues, protect that trust. Join me in voting no. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.